A little while ago, I want to say maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, I made a video about what I think about the comic book industry as far as the state that the comic book industry is in. And I understand there are those who think it is all over. I am not one of those people. I do not believe it is all over. I believe things are shifting and we are seeing the rise of independent creators. Now, some are calling this the Iron Age. Um, I was not really familiar with that term as far as referring to this age of comics. I want to say it was like maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. I heard that term and I was like, well, what are they talking about? Oh, they're talking about this age of comics. They refer to it as the Iron Age. Okay, I get it. But I'm not sure if I hold the same viewpoint as some that everything is all over. I think many of the things we see happening actually gives a legitimate reason uh, for me to think that things will turn around and probably are on that path to turning around. I don't think it's all over. So I want to read this article from Bounding into Comics. Mark Mylar claims comic book industry is in the worst state it's ever been. Suggests comic book legends return to DC and Marvel in order to save it. Now I'll tell you what I think. I believe Mylar, maybe Miller is how you pronounce his name, but there's an A at the end. Never uh, um, seen that spelled that way if it is Miller. Anyway, I digress. I don't know if there is necessarily a need for legends to return in and of itself. Let me start there. But let me start by reading the article. Comic book writer Mark Mylar, known for his Superman, Red Sun, Civil War, Wanted, and Kingsman stories, recently posited that the comic book industry is in the worst state it's ever been and proceeded to share his idea on how to save it. Now, I will agree that I think comic books, as far as sales, as far as enjoyment, is probably in one of the worst states it's been in ever, arguably. Now, if you follow my channel, I try to keep it positive, but I'm not going to stick my head in the sand like an ostrich and act like I don't see what's going on. I see the state of modern comic books. I go into my modern comic book shop and find myself buying back issues more often than not. But I think this actually presents an opportunity. That's what I see. I don't necessarily see this as, oh, everything is coming to an end. Yeah, things are shifting and it is bad, but this presents the opportunity for several things. Independent creators creating their own things and new people coming into the comic book space, but under one caveat. So here's the problem. You have people who enter the comic book space to push an agenda. Now, I have said this, and I will restate what I've said before. If you have a certain ideology, at some point in your creative process, those ideas will bleed themselves out naturally. That's just gonna happen. There's a difference between that and pushing certain ideas and shoving certain ideas down people's throats. And I really believe that is what has been going on with comic books, and the stories suffer because of this. If I created a comic book and my only idea was to push my ideals down your throat, that would not make for a good story, because what I would be doing is trying to craft a story around how I can shove whatever it is I want you to see of my ideas down your throat, versus just creating a good story. And in my natural, organic creation process, my ideas will spill over, but it will be organic, the readers can see that. And it's just like, it is what it is, but this is a good story. All right, I'll go on and further read an article. During an appearance on the Thinking Critical channel, Mylar confirmed his previously announced return to DC for a Superman story, and then quickly segued into positing his idea that at least 20 comic book legends should return to both DC and Marvel to do at a minimum 2-year runs in order to save the comic book industry. Now, he may be right about this, but I think there's also another way. I think in the hiring practices at both Marvel and DC, since they're the two biggest content houses, there needs to be a very strict eye for good artists and good stories. People who come in with the sole purpose of pushing an agenda. It's like, hey, buddy, do you love comic books? Are you familiar with these characters? Because if you're not, that's a problem. And I think that's the problem that is created or has been created in the comic book space. You have too many people who get into the comic book space who really have no interest in the comic book space. They just see it as a medium to push whatever idea it is they have. And it's like, hey, we want good stories. We want to enjoy what we read. That's what we want. And I think if they hired people that had that mentality, like, yo, I'm here to bring you a good story, written and drawn by a great artist. That is our sole purpose. We want to make sure this is something you will enjoy reading and visualizing. And I'm not sure that happens. Now, the Legends, this is where I agree with him. The Legends understood that. They understood people don't care about what I think outside of what this character is getting ready to do. They don't care about that. They just want a good story and they want the visuals to be good. Mylar stated, there's something weird going on right now where I really feel like guys like me and guys who've worked in the industry for a while and been very lucky, had a lot of big books and everything. We've got to man the stations. Like I said, he may be correct. I think everybody got to come in and do a couple of projects and find an artist who is as good as you can possibly get. He is saying exactly what I'm saying. And just do some killer run on something, he added. I agree with this 100%. You see, the focus just needs to be on a good story and a good artist. These things really do have to match. So many of these new executives think they can just push a gimmicks, and us comic book geeks who've been reading these comics since our teenage years will just sop it up. And that's not true. If you've been into comics for any length of time, I would say, let's say 5 to 10 years plus, then at some point you start to become seasoned in your eye and what you're looking for. You look for certain things to come up in the beginning of a story to grab you. You look for certain things in art. It doesn't have to be the same as, some other artists, but there are things you look for to denote quality art. And when you don't see those things, you check out. I've said that many times on this channel. Okay. As for why he believes these comic book legends should return, he explained it's because the industry is in the worst state it's ever been in. Look, there are stories and articles about comic book shops that really will not pick up brand new books. They're primarily selling back issues because people don't want to buy a lot of the new stories. And, if you're watching my channel, I've been reviewing the Wildcats reboot that I'm enjoying. And the reason I'm enjoying it is the story is good and the art is good. And it's drawn me in. I started reading back issues of Immortal Hulk. Man, The story is great, and Joe Bennett's art, oh man, it matches the story magnificently. That's a recipe for success. Why these comic companies can't see this, I cannot explain. I do not know. He said the retailers, they're struggling out there. They're dying. All my friends and retailers are saying they've never known it as hard as this. And I'm going to tell you this. I moved last year. The area I moved into, there was a local comic book store, not even, I would say, 3 minutes from my house. And I was like, this is great. I got here. It was a decent store. I walked in. I was like, okay, I like this store. That store went out of business maybe a month or 2 months after I got here. I don't know how long they had been there, and I don't know what exactly what affected this shutdown, what brought that about, but I would imagine it was sales. People are not excited. I remember when I was growing up, me and my cousin and some of my friends, we would walk to this comic book store that was probably, I don't know, I want to say it was a good maybe 2.5 miles, 3 miles away from the apartment we lived in. And we were happy. Now, of course, this is Brooklyn, so it's city blocks. You know how it is. If you know anything about New York, you know what it is. But we were happy to go to this comic book store. And to my knowledge, to my recollection, now, things always change with your memory. You remember things not necessarily as they are. But to my memory, when we walked into these comic book stores, they were always filled with people buying stuff. Now, that doesn't mean everything that was released when I was younger in the early 90s was all good. There was some trash books, but there were enjoyable books and storylines to read. It's not necessarily the case now. You might go a little bit before you find something that you can actually enjoy. Mylar then further elaborated on his idea to bring comic book legends back. And I was like, okay, let's get Oliver Coipel and Pepe Larraz or whatever, and we go and do a Captain America and a Wolverine run or something. Everybody's got to come back and 2 runs. And if 20 big name writers and 20 big name artists do that, you've got an amazing couple of years of comic books. And what else that would do, it would also inspire people coming up after them to actually create something good. Don't come to me with your agenda. Don't come to me with some ideology you just want to shove down people's throats. Give me a good story with a good artist, man. That's what we need. We need to get something like that going again. You want to see some excitement at Marvel and DC again, I think, he asserted. Reacting to Mylar's proposition, UL Carter, I might be mispronouncing some of these names because I'm not familiar with all of these people. I fell off from comics for many years, and there's many names that some I don't remember. They were around back in the day and they just weren't, I wasn't into their stuff. And so I don't remember. And some are fairly new, came around during the time I dropped off. So I don't know. The proprietor of Fantastic Four Comics in Berkeley, California, suggested that either Mark Millar or Todd McFarlane write Spider-Man, explaining because that's the book it needs to be. Of course, everybody knows that. I would definitely be down for a Todd McFarlane Spider-Man run, 100%. I know it's unlikely, and of course, he works for DC now, but imagine getting Jim Lee, or as a matter of fact, no, let's take this. Will's Portacio, get him to do a run of X-Men as the artist. Now, I don't know who we can get to write it, but him on the art, man, you find a really dynamic writer, and you have a recipe for success. Mylar then went on to share his view that Marvel and DC need to do well in order to drive creator-owned success. I actually agree with this. I think the better Marvel and DC do at actually telling good stories, the more people will be interested in comics, and the more fans and new fans will be driven to comic books. This is partly what got me into comic books. I entered the space at a time where comic book artists and stories were going through a boom, and it paid off. I mean, I was sucked in hook, line, and sinker. In reality, in the last 10 years, there hasn't been a really big blow up success in the creator-owned world. I disagree with that. I think there has been some successes, but it's neither here nor there. Go on and read. Saga was probably the last one that went crazy. Things have done, they've done nicely, but Saga was the last time there was a phenomenon. I think Walking Dead prior to that. So, there's been a few. And yeah, and like I said, there's more. Maybe some things he's unfamiliar with right now that are actually doing very well. I'm going to go ahead and throw it out there. Rippaverse is one of them. I know some may not want to hear that, but it is. But the real success comes from the industry and not talking about as individuals, as creators. It comes from the industry when Marvel and DC are doing well, particularly Marvel. And I have to say, I agree with this. I think when DC and Marvel do well, they also foster an environment where other people do well, very well. When comic sales are up across these big two, I think across all other independent creators, they're raised up as well. I want them to do well. I really do. I don't think they're going to collapse. I think DC and Marvel may not be, and I've said this before, they may not be what we remember, but I don't think they're just going to collapse and go away completely. And again, people hate to hear this because you're making money for the man. You're showing it up. You're showing it up a corporation. But the honest truth is that creator-owned growth comes from Marvel and DC doing well. I have to say, I can agree with his premise here. From there, Mylar returned to his idea to save the industry and noted that the current output from the companies are just not good. And again, I hate to focus on the negative. I try to stick to things I enjoy, but I enjoy this article and I'll sum it up at the end. I have a positive outlook because of this. But he is correct. When I go into the comic book store and I thumb through some of these books, I'm like, oh man, what is happening? Everybody needs to go back to do 1 or 2 projects, I think. And I'm going to try and get my friends to do this over the next couple of years. Try and get some excitement going back at the companies. Obviously, there's some great books. There are 2 or 3 good books. I think at DC right now, but you need 20 good books. There needs to be 20 great books, he stated. Agreed. Mylar continued, and you can go back and look at these other periods in history. Look at the 90s, look at the 80s, look at the 60s. There were so many books that I couldn't afford to buy all the books I wanted to buy. This right here, I've said this before. When I was young, if I had the money I have now, I would probably, no joke, have a collection of 30 or 40,000 comic books. Because there was a time in the early 90s, I wanted to buy the entire comic book store. But I had like maybe $10 to spare. It was torture. And nobody's in that position anymore. Everybody's like, yeah, there's only 2 things worth checking out. And that's really sad. I want to see people in that position again, where they're holding $20 in their hand but they need $60 for the number of comic books that come out that week, he detailed. And of course, you also got to account for inflation. Just your money doesn't go as far buying comic books as it used to. Now that's, neither here nor there. Really nothing you can do about that. But I just wanted to go ahead and throw that out there. Mylar is not the only one to suggest the comic book industry is struggling. Rod Lamberti, the owner of Rodman Comics in Ankeny, Iowa, revealed in a blog post at Bleeding Cool that that his new comic sales are declining. He stated, "New comic sales here in the comic store are increasingly slowing down. The recent death of Miss Marvel and Amazing Spider-Man was not a big deal at the store." And that's the thing. A lot of comic book companies, they think automatically if we kill someone off, we'll bring people in. And that's just not always true. I think some people can tell that's sometimes done in an act of lazy storytelling. The latest issues of Iron Man and Hulk are low sellers. The characters have fans, but few are interested in the latest adventures, Lamberti added. And again, very unfortunate. DC Studios CEO James Gunn also informed Michael, I think is this going into another article? No, okay. Yeah, let me finish reading this. DC Studios James Gunn also informed Michael Rosenbaum earlier this year, I started out, I wanted to write comic books when I was younger. If I was writing comic books today, I'd probably be unhappy because so few people are reading comic books. But what they don't understand is this is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are not reading comic books because writers are being hired that care more about agendas than they do good stories. And we comic book fans are checking out. As far as other ideas to try and rejuvenate interest in DC and Marvel, Jim Lee believes James Gunn can do that. I'm going to have to go ahead. Jim Lee is one of my comic book heroes, my favorite artist personally, and I'm going to have to disagree with him. I don't think James Gunn is going to save comic books. I think they need to do an overhaul and an inventory of how they're telling stories. What's the focus? Is the focus, hey, we need to make sure we have this person and representation of this and this thing and that thing? Or is it, is the story good? It is really that simple. Is the story good? Forget the other nonsense. Make a good story. He explained to the Hollywood Reporter, it's amazing to have partners in Peter and James, particularly James. He was a comics fan growing up and knows our mythology inside and out. And having that kind of ally in the live action space allows us to really leverage what he's doing and allow us to market and sell comic books to new readers. Now, while I do agree with him, and I've always made this or had this issue with comic book companies that hire people to do these live action adaptations, and these people are not even fans of comic books at all, let alone the movie they are directing. I really take issue with that. These are people who are interested in his movies, his TV shows, and if they want to keep and if they want a deep dive into these characters, he directs them to the comic books he added. Now look, I don't have all of the answers. I really don't have all of the answers. At the end of it says, what do you make of Mylar's idea of saving the comic book industry? Now, I'm going to give my assessment, what I think in lieu of everything that I read there. I believe we're in a great position because I don't think the comic book industry is just going to die. That doesn't mean it can't. I'm not a prophet. I don't know that. But I think when things like this go through such downturns, typically somebody comes along, some unsuspecting person or entity or company or groups of people, and there's a resurgence. And I think you're beginning to see the underpinnings of that in the independent space. And I also believe you're beginning to see, now it's not happening overnight, but I believe you're beginning to see a trickle here and there of individuals beginning to get the point like, yo, we really need to focus on the quality we put out to our fans. We've kind of fell asleep at the wheel and we haven't been putting our best foot forward. We haven't been giving them the best we could give them. We've been lazing around because as big corporations, these corporations think they're going to make money forever. The problem with that mentality in the geek space, you might make billions of dollars over a couple years and making comic book movies, but you have to understand and remember, it is the actual comic book fan that drives those numbers up, right? People start seeing movies, and when a geek like me tells my friends that are not into the geek space, yo, this new so-and-so movie, whatever comic book movie was dope. It veered from the comics a little bit, but I understand. And here's why it was dope. It was great. Those people are on the authority of my word because they know I'm a geek. This is what I do. They're going to say, you know what? I'm going to go check that movie because he said it was good. But you're having the opposite effect. And see, these companies never accounted for that. They never accounted for the fact that us geeks that made these things staples, because we're the one who spent our money buying this stuff before the average person got interested. And when we stop spending our money and when we start saying, this thing kind of sucks, people listen. And they're like, yeah, you're kind of right. Yeah, I trust your authority. You've been reading this for years. Yeah, it does suck. But I think the opportunity that this has created for people who are, look, if I was an artist, I'm going to tell you right now, if I was an artist or a writer right now, and I knew I got some killer stories. Now, this is a bold play. I don't know how you would do it. I'm not saying this would be easy. If there was a way for you to get to either Marvel or DC and meet with someone, I would say, look at your comic book sales. Storylines suck. I have a great story. Let me find the artist for this story I want to tell. And I guarantee you this book would do well. And I believe there is storytellers out there that can make that case and can actually make this happen. And I believe, I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but I do believe we are headed for a turnaround. And the excitement in some of the independent spaces, in my humble opinion, is proof positive of that.